for being here, and I think we actually are live. I'll just edit out the rest. But I'm sitting here with Scott Thomas and Stephen Holbrook. Stephen, do you go by Steve? Stephen?
Whichever.
Okay, I'm kind of Jedediah or Jed. Either one is fine. I'm with the Utah Historical Quarterly, and this is another podcast on Utah history. We are here to, the winter 2018 issue of the Utah Historical Quarterly features an article by Scott Thomas called Re-Examining the Radical, Stephen Holbrook and the Utah Strategy for Protesting the Vietnam War. And so again, I'm joined by Scott and Steve. And we really wanted to talk about, Steve, your activism during the war, but I think we also want to think more broadly about your life and dig into that. So thanks both of you for being here. Appreciate it. So Scott, you're an old friend who has a BA and MA degrees from BYU. And, one thing about you, you're well-versed in extra-legal violence in territorial Utah. Scott,
right into this.
What do listeners need to know about your research? Just briefly to introduce yourself.
That I've looked at and studied violence in Utah during the territorial period, as you mentioned. And I got curious with that back in the undergraduate program and just decided I would take that to the master's level and really enjoyed it. But in the meantime, it also kind of sparked interest in social movements in general and protest movements especially. And so that's what kind of pushed me towards this topic as well.
Well, maybe we can just stay on that point. How, in your article, you examine broadly the anti-war movement in Utah, and you mentioned trends nationwide. How did you come to settle on Holbrook as a subject, or as like the core of your article?
Of the research?
Yeah.
No, great question. As I was telling Mr. Holbrook previously, a lot of this stemmed from interest in the anti-war movement in general as kind of a protest movement, and being, focused on Utah history, I wanted to see how Utah fit in the broader scheme, and if there was any differences here specifically. So as I started digging into the archives, I had the great luck of Mr. Holbrook having recently donated all those back when I was starting the research. So I dove into his writings and clippings, and there were boxes and boxes full of information, and that spurred me towards deeper and deeper kind of examination, not only of the movement, but by default, Stephen Holbrook, who to me seemed to be the deeper I went, the more convinced I was that he was at the center of what was happening as far as activism in general in Utah during that period, prior to the anti-war movement and after the anti-war movement as well, which I thought was really unique. But my article focused generally on the anti-war movement. I talk a little bit in the beginning about his civil rights work, and then obviously focus on the anti-war movement, but then also looked at somewhat, not in the article, it's not very detailed, but I did try to talk a little bit about his exit from the anti-war movement, but his continued activism in other areas.
Right. So the Historical Society has the papers of Stephen Holbrook.
Yes.
And there's a really good photograph collection in there as well. So all the photographs in the article come from that collection, from images that either you took.
They're all good.
Well, yeah,
or at least interesting.
Yeah, you either took them, in some cases I think, or you're also the subject of most of them. Are there other collections in Utah related to anti-war activism? There have been other articles written on this subject.
Yeah, in fact, there's some great interviews with Holbrook and others down at Utah Valley University that were conducted back in the early 2000s with not only Stephen Holbrook, but other activists of the time. And I can't think of the exact names that do have papers and interviews down there, but
right.
it was very, so they do exist, yes.
Okay. Well, great. I'll have other questions for you, Scott, about your article. People can obviously read it and enjoy it, but Steve, we'll turn to you, and it's a pleasure to have you join us. I think a lot of our readers will know something of who you are in your life. We'll dig into that. You've led, as Scott has told me many times and introduced me more to your doings. You've led a fascinating, multi-dimensional life, and something we want to talk about. So, and I think the way we'll do this is Scott and I will sort of team up. So we'll each ask you questions, I'm sure, and we can just make this a kind of an organic, free-flowing conversation, hopefully. But I'll begin. So I want to start with just get a thumbnail sketch of your early life up to when you participated in the Freedom Summer Project. Was that 64? So where were you born and raised, and what was your upbringing?
I grew up in Bountiful. My family were in business out there, had been in business for about 90 years, and came from a father who was a Republican and a mother who later became a Democrat but was voting Republican. I organized teenage Republican clubs all across the state. When I was 16 and 17, I was introduced to Eisenhower when I was 10 by my neighbor who became the treasurer of the United States under Eisenhower, Ivy Baker Priest. And I was kind of taken under wing by a woman named Helen Brown, later Helen Brown Romney, who married the father of the former Attorney General of Utah, Vern Romney. And they took me to Chicago to the national conventions and to LA to the regional conventions and all around the state of Utah to the county conventions. And I met Rockefeller and Goldwater and had some sort of relationship with a variety of Republican power brokers. In Bountiful, I only knew 2 Democrats. I knew of them. I didn't actually know them. But
so in your personal leanings, I mean, you obviously followed the
well, I'd have to say, I think that one of the most important things that had happened in my life was debate in high school, and I won some debate contests, but the important thing about debate is that you have to take 2 sides of a variety of issues. So you become exposed to a variety of points of view and advocating for them. And I would say that helped me develop what was at the very least a liberal kind of republicanism. In Davis County, the Republicans tended to be business-type Republicans. They weren't these sort of extreme right-wing nutcase people that worry about, black helicopters and sort of nonsense, just made up. And so I came from, I think, a more reasonable group of conservatives in growing up. And after I became a Mormon missionary in Hong Kong, and I then went to Chinatown in San Francisco. And at some point, I decided I really was not a believer. I maintained my LDS membership even till today because, sort of as an honor to my forebears, the people who came before me, who sacrificed so much and who went through so much. And I've always had, if I could go through almost every project I've been involved with, and I've always had some sort of support from the LDS Church, whether it was building KRCL or Envision Utah or the homeless shelter. So I'm one of those. You could say if Mormons were talking about it, they'd say that he doesn't have a testimony.
Can I've been curious about this piece, just a little piece of it. You were in Hong Kong,
right? And
then all the different articles talk about, then you end up in San Francisco. How and why?
Okay, well, I was, let's say I was not wholly impressed by the way the mission was operated. And there were lots of missionaries who were going to movies and not spending time doing. I'm sort of kind of person, I'm either in something or I'm not, and in looking back, I probably should have gone to the movies. But
so did you request to?
Yes, I did. Okay. I said because the Mormon mission president there didn't have any interest in learning Chinese, and the mission home was in a ritzy part of Kowloon, a part of Hong Kong, surrounded by big walls with cut glass on the top. And when the local people would come to be baptized, the mission president's wife would go around after with flea patter. And I just thought it just kind of was an ugly American kind of thing, not necessarily Mormon-y, had no relationship to Mormonism per se. I was sensitive to this in part because I remember Lyndon Johnson, who was then vice president, coming through on Air Force Two and buying 200 shirts, which I'm sure was good for the tailors, but it sort of had a like out of reality context to it. Mm-hmm. And one thing that was of interest to me was the longer missionaries had been there, the more interest they had in mainland China, and the more interest they had in what was going on in mainland China, which I thought was good. There wasn't quite the sense of isolation that there was an occasional sense of isolation. The branch that I was most involved with was on the top of a hotel called the Hotel Mabuhay. And I on the way up, on the elevator, you would see American sailors going off into rooms with prostitutes. And then we'd go up and we saw a movie about Salt Lake City. Well, it was sort of like Salt Lake City's the center of the earth, and here I am in this very dynamic city and this very dynamic country with a lot of history, and it just somehow didn't compute to me. So I wrote home, and I ended up having a discussion, an interview with Gordon B. Hinckley, who came down to the airport in San Francisco and met me. And I told him what was going on in the mission, that I thought it was disconnected from the people. And so they reassigned me to San Francisco and then Chinatown in San Francisco, where I learned that I spoke Cantonese almost as well as some of the people in Chinatown at that particular time. And I got very much into it, but as I sort of thought about the things that were of interest to me, in the early LDS Church, there was a lot of prophesying and revelation. And it became obvious to me that that sort of thing didn't really happen anymore, and that what had substituted in its place was something called inspiration, which is I pray about it and I feel good, so that's what I'm going to do. And I just thought, well, I can do that too. So that was sort of, I just decided I was not a believer. I read the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, and I decided that the detail and the hands-on nature of God to prophet relationship simply didn't exist. And I don't have a strong opinion about what Joseph Smith actually saw, didn't see, whatever. He's always been a hero to me in the sense that he was a bright, insightful, inspiring person. And but I wouldn't say I felt the same way about Brigham Young. Brigham Young, in a way, I respect Brigham Young because he was very pragmatic and he dealt with the issues that had to be dealt with. He built the Mormon Empire. But in terms of loving somebody, I wouldn't say, that I fell in love with Brigham Young.
Yeah, and now your family is, I think this is mentioned in the article, your family is deeply, you're multi-generational Mormon. So you come from Mormons on both sides of the family?
Yes. Yeah, my grandmother, Holbrook, who was a Rampton, she was the fourth, or she was the last child of the last wife of forget the first name of the Rampton relative, but she she didn't think too much of polygamy. And some of it was because their father got chased around by the feds and they always had to hide and they weren't allowed to know their children's or their parents' or their father's name. But some of it, I never had as a young person, I didn't have enough sense to ask her all the right questions. And then on my father's side, Joseph Holbrook was one of the founders of Bountiful and the first mayor and a member and a probate judge, and came across the plains and was a friend of Joseph Smith's and was in Missouri and in Illinois. And I know all those stories well. And they were very influential stories in terms of my eventual involvement with the civil rights movement. No question about it.
That's what I wanted to ask is, to what degree do you feel that heritage, that Mormon, heritage informed or prepared you for your activism?
The activism part I'm not sure about, but the sensitivity, the awareness of people not being treated fairly was very acute in my growing up, both from the personal stories in family passed on and from the history, that I was taught. And when people try to compare, what has been my slight, I'm Irish, I was slighted, I'm Italian, I was slighted, I'm black, I was more than slighted, I'm Native American, I was super slighted. There was a period of time in which, when you have something like an extermination order in the state of Missouri, and you start thinking about African Americans not being able to vote in Mississippi or being mistreated through segregation, there's a sort of a confluence of interest and awareness of unfairness.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about how you became involved. Did you come home? You came home from your mission, and that was what year? Are we talking
about 62, I think.
Okay, so within a couple of years, you found yourself in Mississippi, part of the Freedom Summer Project. Right. How did that come to be?
Well, I went back to when I came back, I believe in June. I went out to Jackson Lake to work that summer. I'd arranged it before I left the mission because I didn't want to have to hang around all of the woe-begone stuff that I was going to experience in Bountiful. So I went up there, and I came back and I worked for Sherm Lloyd, who was a Republican candidate for Congress. And I went back, and I had known all these people, as I mentioned before, from my younger, super young Republican days, high school Republican days. So I went back to work for him, and the very first awareness that I had, he and I and his administrative assistant, Lloyd Pullman, went down to see a group of people who had come from Mississippi, and they were marching in front of and picketing in the Justice Department, asking for something to be done to find the killer of Medgar Evers in Mississippi. And I turned to Sherm and said, I really belong in that march. And that was the first sort of time that I thought that. The other thing that happened that summer was that the Great March in Washington took place, and we had a delegation from the NAACP from Utah. And they came back there. So I went to the Great March and heard the I Have a Dream speech. And I came back to Utah ostensibly to help the congressman run for the Senate against Reed Benson. And but as I got involved with the civil rights movement, the congressman noticed I didn't have much time for him, and so I got really involved.
Can I ask you a question about him? Did you? I remember you referenced a couple things in your archive, in your notes that I was able to look at about your relationship with Senator Lloyd. Did you see that as a positive relationship, and did you stay in touch with him after you left his campaign?
I did not stay in touch with him. I considered him a good person, a reasonable guy. He came from Idaho, and he originally was born in Idaho, and he one day said he said he was on the elevator, and he said that if you closed your eyes, you couldn't tell whether a black person or a white person were talking. In other words, he was referring to the education level that he heard in the verbalizations. And this seemed to be a bit of a surprise to him. And I have no doubt that this would have been his first experience in Washington, D.C., where there was such a large black population and interface. I think he was the kind of moderate person who, he wrote me a letter saying he hoped that I wasn't extreme in my views about civil rights. And I think what he meant, it's just kind of, don't go too far too fast kind of mentality. But, I don't think there was any racial hostility on his part. I think he was a good person.
Yeah. I mean, looking back, how did your views on civil rights, how were they evolving during this time? As a child, you mentioned that you were introduced politically to a number of individuals. You felt a connection to, or this sense that everyone should be treated fairly, and that some were not, some groups in particular. Did that become more and more pronounced as the years went on, and by 1964 when you participated in
I think the awareness of what was going on. I mean, growing up in Bountiful, there were no black families. We had a few Latino families, one of whom was one student was our student body president. So that didn't cue me so much about race relations. So it was becoming aware of what was going on in the country.
Yeah. And so you mentioned Medgar Evers. You worked out of the office of Charles Evers, I understand. So the brother of Medgar. What do you recall from that period? What experiences stand out?
Well, when I got to Mississippi, the entire state was in a state of tension. There were something like 50 churches bombed and burned to the ground, black churches that summer. Lots of people getting arrested. I was somewhere between doing some press relations for Mr. Evers, and also would go out from time to time knocking on doors to get African Americans to go down to register and vote. So, and I was living with a black family, which is certainly my first real experience with certainly black Southern culture. And, it was sort of typical in a way. She'd fix okra with bacon and fried chicken, but she was the president of the NAACP in Jackson. And her husband, Ben, was head of a group called the Black Guards. And what they were a kind of a self-defense group that was tied into the taxi services that served the black community. And they just kept in touch by radio to sort of protect each other and pass the word on about things that were going on. So, and they were holding mass meetings at least weekly there. And then I went around the state to mass meetings around the state with the NAACP National Board, which is where I then met the people who were eventually charged with murdering the 3 civil rights workers, Sheriff Rainey and Deputy Price. And we sat up on the second floor of the Neshoba County Courthouse with the NAACP board and these 2 supposedly law enforcement people inquiring about the investigation, about the now the local scuttlebutt was they're dead and these people have something to do with it. And so, and the town was hostile when we went there. I mean, you could see from people standing on the street, and you saw, rifles and so forth. So, I felt I was sort of in a combination of being angry at self-righteously angry about what I was experiencing. So, it numbed me to the fear of what I, a reasonable person would have sort of thought. I should be afraid about being here. And I think the experiencing with the people who were, the people I stayed with had orchestrated a boycott of Jackson, Mississippi businesses. And they'd been hauled away in garbage trucks and all sorts of things. And this was a case where, if the whole town, if you went into a clothing store, a black person couldn't try on a pair of pants. A white person could. I mean, they had very specific reasons for wanting to boycott and try to get something different going on. But just experiencing the incredible courage and valor of these people who were at risk. I mean, I was at risk, but I was at risk with some kind of backup back home, whereas they were home, and the risks that they were taking were life-threatening.
So, I don't mean to jump too far ahead, but you were embedded in this, in the civil rights movement. You were a part of it. You come back to Utah. You get involved with the NAACP here. What was the transition point out of civil rights into the anti-war? And I know in general in the United States it wasn't uncommon for people involved in the civil rights movement to flow into the anti-war movement. What was it for you that triggered that movement?
A couple of things. One was I was exposed to more people and points of view in the civil rights movement, particularly in Mississippi, who had some awareness of the war. I began reading journals that I became aware of in that movement. I think one was called Liberation. There was a writer called, I think it's I.F. Stone, who wrote a lot of good work on the Vietnam War. So I became more conscious of the war. I think the experience of the civil rights movement, in particular in Mississippi, gave me a skepticism about whether or not everything all the things that we sort of typically believed, i.e. our government is telling us the truth, or we shouldn't just go along kind of thing, created kind of skepticism that allowed me to fairly early start being involved in the anti-war movement. And I think my first action was I left Mississippi the summer of '65, which was the second summer I was there, and I went to an action in Washington, D.C. called the Assembly of Unrepresented People. And we went to the Capitol to get arrested, and did so. And that was on the war. I think, a lot of when we jump ahead later in the student movement, I don't think most of the people in the student movement had any idea either that I'd been involved in civil rights or what my anti-war involvement had been. So I was just sort of blending in, and that's a whole nother story. But
do you see that as a positive or a negative? The fact that you kind of blended in, they didn't have an awareness of maybe your resume. Did that allow you to interact a little differently with them?
I think that's life, That's the way it is. There was another factor too, and that was that as the Black Power movement sort of took on some strength, I think there was a sense I was probably speaking too much for the NAACP, and I think that it was a good thing to transition out.
Okay, no, that's interesting.
Maybe, so you spend the couple of weeks or a couple of months in Mississippi in '64? I
spent my summers of '64 and '65.
Yeah, okay, so you go back in '65, and at one point you spent some time in jail. Is that correct?
The first summer I was in jail. The second summer I was also arrested, but didn't go to jail.
Yeah.
The first summer I was with a local young black woman and a minister to be, as I recall. And we went down to the Neshoba County, or not to the Neshoba County, to the Hinds County Courthouse in Jackson with an African-American woman to register her to vote. While she was in registering it. To this day, I don't know whether she got registered or not, because I was out in the hallway taking pictures of the whites only signs on the fountains and the bathrooms, and the sheriff of Hinds County came and personally arrested me, and I was charged with breach of the peace. And in that process, I was sitting, waiting to do whatever they're going to do with me. And he apparently invited a number of county employees, or city and county employees, to walk past me and make various comments. So there was sort of this line of people. And one of them said to me, "Oh, from Utah, huh? Well, how many N-word wives do you have?" And I said, "Well, you've got that one wrong."
Wow.
I mean, at some point in your papers, you you mentioned that this is a quote unquote radicalizing experience to have participated, and just to, I guess, to build off what you've been talking about, Scott. I mean, how you also indicate, and I don't know if this comes from an interview. Do you recall? You say it was a radicalizing experience, that it opened up a big door for my inquiring mind about a lot of things. So you come back to Utah, and you find, and you sort of become involved right away in the anti-war movement. How did you approach your role in that space? Like, did you approach it from a conciliatory position, or like were you strategic in how you went about sort of protesting this?
Initially, I think my first anti-war demonstration march was like, I think there were 18 people there, and it was led by Ammon Hennessy, who was kind of a Workers of the World Joe Hill House homeless advocate. Had a couple of different locations for something he called the Joe Hill House. And so I would say he was the leader of this small group. As time went on, and I became more involved at the University of Utah and became a member of Students for Democratic Society, SDS, I had a different group of people that I was involved with. And what I did slowly but eventually in a more major way was to try to figure out how to involve thousands instead of dozens. And that was my main, I would say that was my main contribution to the anti-war movement. There were others, but I think that was the main one.
So I mean, talk about how that came to be. How do you go from 18 protesters to thousands? I mean, because we have these, and Scott, you document these. They take place primarily after 67, but into the early 70s. I mean, we have some really, really large protests that take place here in downtown Salt Lake. Elsewhere in Utah, or was it primarily here in Salt Lake?
There were other smaller groups in Provo and up at Utah State area.
What gave the movement for you? I mean, obviously nationwide the movement was rolling, but here in Utah, what made you? I mean, did you see this as a success, being able to bring thousands of people into the movement?
Well, in terms of ending the war, I'm not sure we were ever successful because it went on forever.
Sure.
In terms of growing the anti-war movement, some of it came naturally just because it had caught on campus and there were more people involved there than there were with Ammon Hennessy. But my main contribution, I think because I'd done the press work both with the NAACP in Utah and also in Mississippi, and I saw in politics, how it was done, that I saw everything that we did through the lens of communicating with a larger number of people. And that eventually ended up with buying time both on local television and also on the rock stations to get people to come out to the anti-war march. Because the university, I would say that the university, the hardcore, anti-war people were somewhere between 250 and 500 people. There might have been 1,000 at some point. The larger numbers of people came from the broader community once we got out into the, to let people know. Now today, it's different because the internet allows people to organize in such a way that we simply didn't have a means to do that. We couldn't get an article in the paper saying there will be a march tomorrow, turn up. In fact, some of the Tribune was very reluctant to cover us at all, a lot of times. I think that some of their old-line editors thought it was irresponsible to be against a war. And that sort of gets back to where the skepticism comes in, where you say maybe our leaders don't always decide the right thing, or they decide for the wrong reasons. And that's a big part of what went wrong with the Vietnam War. We had, World War II is seen, I think, rightly as a necessary war, perhaps the Korean War, but there was no thought of what is Vietnam, what is its history, what do the people there really want, who are the people that we're really supporting, and it's all of that really comes, that defines why the war didn't go well.
Well, in Utah, you talk about taking it from 18 people to hundreds and then eventually thousands, which in my research too panned right out. That's what happened. But it seemed to me, and I'm curious to see your view on this, that a large reason, you identified the Tribune and other major news outlets were not willing to give you a platform, you or any of your cohorts, a platform. Nobody was able to speak out. But instead, so you staged protests, you staged sit-ins at the Tribune and other locations, which at times seemed to be extremely successful. You end up getting coverage on KSL, who's covering your sit-ins and then you're given, and it seems to grow over time. And to me, it seems like there were two main reasons. Is A, you came at it from I felt was a very strategic standpoint. You were willing to ruffle feathers. You were willing to draw attention. But I think one of the key points was you didn't bring violence into it. And to me, it seemed like you're constantly kind of keeping that at bay. To the point to where you're working with the local police, which to me, and in my research, I've never seen that during the anti-war movement, which I thought was genius. And you talk in a couple different interviews that you ran into that, his name's leaving me now, Captain Patrick.
Right.
You ran into him a few times after the anti-war. But would you say that was, in general, a large part of the quote-unquote success of what you were doing is that you were willing to not only collaborate inside your circle, but you were more than willing to collaborate with people outside the circle?
Well, we told the police what we're doing because we wanted them to protect us. And having experienced the civil rights movement, I felt like the whole nonviolent approach was the only approach that really worked in terms of American. The whole point of any demonstration is to change hearts and minds. I think the downside of most of what we did was that it was the event that was covered and not the issues that were at the heart of the Vietnam War. And that, in part, is why we ended up on Social Hall Avenue demanding time from all the TV stations for serious discussion about the war itself, and not what the hippies were wearing at the march or whether or not we were arrested. And I think that if you read most of the coverage, it was not about the finer points of what's wrong with the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. Well, to that point too, we the people. Mm-hmm. I felt this was one of the most fascinating pieces for me, was your We the People night, where you get sponsors, so you get some funding behind you. You rent a location. Well, the space, if I remember right, was provided to you.
Right.
You have this beautiful banquet and this counter dinner to Nixon and Agnew's dinner downtown, right, at $100 a plate. Yours is 50 cents, and you get 400 plus people to show up, and you provide dinner and lectures, music, if I remember, poetry, and childcare. which I thought was phenomenal. Because, as you said earlier, or you just stated, part of the problem was the message wasn't being heard, the spectacle was being watched. And to me, from my research and what I was able to dig up and find about you, I felt like that is a major part of this, is you seem to be constantly pushing back not only the violent, but also the spectacle aspect. Just trying to push that aside to be like, no, it's the message that's important. It's the platform we're trying to push. That's what people need to listen to. Did you feel that was successful?
I think it was to a certain extent. If you look at the later anti-war marches, you would see photos of people holding placards regarding women's rights, gay rights, environment. So all kinds of movements started bubbling out, and they were all message movements. To do the first Earth Day in Utah at the park, Sugar House Park, we had to go into the U.S. Federal District Court to get permission to do it, to force them to do it, because they didn't like us.
Isn't this the one where they wouldn't let you use a speaker? Didn't they take away the ability for you to be able to even talk while you were there? Or is this a different one?
I don't remember that. I just remember we had to go into federal court because they wouldn't give permission for us to even use the park to do the first Earth Day. So you had all these different movements bubbling out. So there were a variety of messages. Child care would have been an issue, that we were saying something about child care. Parenthetically, just to jump ahead a little bit, when I got in the legislature, the majority leader called me into her office and said she pulled out all these transcripts of the state liquor police who had been assigned to watch us at this event and also at the event of the picket of Vice President Agnew coming into town, and she reads to me all of their reports on what we're doing. I said, I was there, I know what happened. It was clear that she was doing this because she was trying to intimidate me, that somehow we know something about you.
We have dirt on you.
Yeah. Except to me it wasn't dirt, it was all in the newspaper.
Well, what about your relationship to the LDS Church officially as an anti-war protester? There's I know that as the local chapter of the NAACP in '63 does a little march downtown. You personally met with a couple of members, of high-ranking church leaders, members of the First Presidency, I believe.
Right.
What's the backstory to that episode?
Okay, so the NAACP was considering whether or not to have initially a friendly picket of LDS Church asking that they take a position on civil rights. And it was, as things were happening on the three national networks, every night there was sort of a roundup, this is what's going on around the country, and there was this was listed as one of the things that might happen, was that there might be a picket of the LDS Church Conference. So Sterling McMurran set up who was provost at the University of Utah and had been Secretary of Education in the Kennedy administration, set up a meeting for myself, Dr. Chuck Neighbors, and Albert Fritz, the president of the NAACP. With President McKay was bedridden, I believe, by that time, so it was with President Hugh B. Brown and President Nathan Allen Tanner. And we went into the meeting, and they were very friendly. But I think one of the first things that President Brown said, well, you know the church doesn't get involved in politics. So I listed for him several occasions on which they had, including the Taft-Hartley law or right-to-work law and others, including even a statement on the draft pre-World War II. And he said, well, we do get involved if there's a moral issue. And so we suggested that it was a moral issue that we were concerned about. And he said, well, get us copies of what other churches have said. And then the implication was he would be taking this to President McKay. And so Dr. Neighbors called him back, or he took the materials to him and then called him back, and he said, I can't tell you whether there'll be a statement. President McKay doesn't like a gun put against his head. And by that, he meant the threat of a march.
Yeah, you mentioned he's an old Scotsman.
He's an old Scotsman, exactly right. But then he called Dr. Neighbors in at a later point and said there will be a statement. So President Brown did give a statement, and it was done sort of as if it was an official church statement, although later it was sort of backtracked on. This was just him talking, and then later it was pulled out as evidence of the church's good faith on the issue. So it sort of went through several permutations. You know, a lot of people didn't like us even messing with the brethren. I felt like I was part of the family, that, you know, it was not foreign to me. I was not a hostile character, and they were not enemies. So for me, it was a different kind of experience than it might have seemed to other people.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up here? You don't seem to have very many, if any, enemies. Why?
Maybe I haven't done enough there.
See, I don't think that would be the correct answer, though. I think I was curious because I think this whole bridge building that you stated in several interviews and other things seems to underlie this effort to always be growing a network, never burning it down. And I wonder, you know, as not only in the anti-war movement, but what you end up doing afterwards, if that's, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm curious for your view. Did that serve you well post anti-war movement?
When we did the social hall protest, and we were meeting, we had a couple of thousand people out on social hall that night, and we met with each of the station's managers that night. And when I went inside KSL and met with the, I think it was Joe Kerr who met with us and later became vice president of Bonneville. And it was all, I would say that on a personal basis, I never felt a sense of antagonism. I was always sort of up front. I was bold in that I asked for what we wanted. And in that case, all three stations gave us time. And we had the debates. And they had both sides, which is fine. You know, you have to assume that you can have an opposition. If your points don't stand up, they don't stand up. But coming out of that, a few years later, I was able to go back to Joe Kerr and get a lot of free equipment for building KRCL.
What about with your, at least I didn't find during the anti-war movement a lot of information regarding any interactions with the church hierarchy during the anti-war movement. Is that fair to say? You didn't have as much interaction during that time, but it seems like you did post, after you left.
Yeah, I suppose they were not really seen as the decision makers or the opinion makers on the issue. I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, so you didn't target them specifically as major players?
No, I don't think so. The only anti-war effort that I remember was when, in regard to the LDS Church, and it was only sort of peripheral. Richard Nixon came to town. This is very late in the anti-war movement, and came to meet over at the LDS Church, as you know, sort of tradition. All the candidates come to meet. But there was a large anti-war contingency out front there picketing him. And I don't know if you know the name Bruce Roberts, but Bruce Roberts was very active in the anti-war movement, and he founded and operated the Cosmic Aeroplane bookstore for a number of years. And Bruce put out a little leaflet at the time in advance that said something like, and he was what I'd call there were several elements in the anti-war movement, one of which was kind of the hippie, yippie crowd, if you want to put it that way. He put out a leaflet, about 10,000 of them, or no, that's not where the 10,000 goes. He put out a leaflet that said, 10,000 hippies will strip and strut their stuff in front of the church office building on such and such a date. And so the police went crazy, and that was one of the fun things. That was the sort of student age, kind of hijinks aspect to the anti-war movement that went on, the sort of the teasing them.
Right. So you didn't have direct interactions, negative interactions with, say, President Benson or President Peterson or Ernest Wilkinson down at BYU. There is when you look at the differences between the protesting at the University of Utah campus and BYU, and either of you could probably speak to this. So Scott, you also, you mentioned some of this in your essay, but what were some of the differences between, protests that happened here in Salt Lake and those in Provo?
The ones, and Stephen can correct me if I'm wrong, but the ones in Utah, or the ones at the University of Utah versus the few that were down at Provo, you're talking about much larger numbers here, and B, it seemed like they weren't as able to demonstrate it necessarily on the campus as they were outside the campus. They did coordinate a couple marches and things around the campus, but as far as on campus went, it was very minimal, if any. Is that a fair statement? And at the U, not only was there large numbers, but there were times where it did get a little aggressive.
We appreciated their bravery because it wasn't at all clear that Ernie Wilkinson liked what they were doing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of them too talked about caravanning and coming up to the events that were being held here in Salt Lake, and but they were very proud to wear that badge of protesting against. And there were certain colleges within the university that did sponsor and provide some alternate voices on campus, but even those were few and far between, especially in comparison to the type of debate at times too that was happening on the University of Utah campus, where they were bringing in well-known and respected kind of leaders in the anti-war movement from outside of Utah, debating senators and legislatures there on campus. So
right. Well, maybe speaking of that, on the cover of the winter 2018 Utah Historical Quarterly is an image that we found at the Marriott Library at the U of protesters on the steps of the administration building, protesting not granting tenure to Earl Jones, who was an art professor. Do you have any recollections of that particular protest, and were you involved?
I knew Earl. Is that not later? I don't.
That was we dated about 1970.
70.
Although we didn't have an exact.
Yeah, I was not really involved with that. I knew Earl, and I don't think I even knew about that until later.
Okay. Yeah, it's a great image. I think you'll find it interesting. But
the biggest interactions that I remember at the administration building were that when we had about we had a few hundred people from the anti-war movement had basically occupied the administration building, and with the intent of getting arrested. However, we were very careful to read the law, and the law said that you are not trespassing if you didn't block ingress and egress. So we carefully made aisleways so that theoretically anybody could get through, and eventually beat the rap because we had actually followed the law. However, apparently we terrified the president's secretary, who hid herself in the closet.
So she wasn't able to get out.
She wasn't able to get out of the closet because she put herself in there.
So during this time of the anti-war protests here in Utah, how did you sustain yourself? I mean, it doesn't seem like anti-war activism and civil rights activism is a very lucrative job or profession. So how were you able to strike a balance there? So you could have the time necessary and the funds necessary to be out on the streets? Because, I mean, at every turn from what I found, you're there. You're putting together protests, you're putting together meetings, you're helping create interactions with local news agencies, etc. You're demonstrating, you're protesting. How did you afford to do it?
I lived cheaply, for one thing. For another, I had access to work through my family.
Okay.
In their business. I was the
So you did work during that time?
I did work. I didn't work full time because
Okay.
I was almost full time doing anti-war stuff.
That's
But
the impression
I
I got.
with my family business, I did everything from decorating windows to being the treasurer to doing the employee trust or employee profit sharing plan. And I had some resources from the family that I actually, when I loaned the business money and they paid me 15% interest. So I had enough to get by on.
Okay.
Very, very late in the anti-war movement, there was a guy, Walter Morrison, who was an oil developer, and he came to me and said that he wanted to send me a monthly check for my work. It was never quite clear what it was he thought I was supposed to be doing, and I don't remember how long it went on, maybe 6 months. And he did the same thing with my friend Jeff Fox, who was also very active in the anti-war movement and an active student at the U. Later, he sent word through Jeff that he was cutting off the money because I had too many quote-unquote homosexes coming to my house.
So he stopped giving you funding at that point?
Well, and apparently
was he from here in
apparently
Utah?
was spying on me.
I was going to say, so was he from Utah? Was Morrison from
I
here?
don't even know.
Not sure.
All I know was that it was Walter Morrison, and he had a girlfriend by the name of Isla Bell Shanahan, and he died, and she got the money.
So you never met him personally?
No, I met him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But he called me. He called me one day and said he wanted to give me money. And it also turned out that he had some vision that I should be going to South America and writing about insurgencies there. He never told me that, and it was of no interest to me. So
That is interesting, though, that he would request that.
Well, so looking back, I mean, what do you feel is important for people to understand about Utah's anti-war movement and protest movement in the late 60s, 70s? I mean, Scott, you made the argument in your article, in your essay, that Utah's anti-war scene is slightly different than that found elsewhere in the country.
Yep.
And say Holbrook, that you're largely responsible for that.
I wouldn't put it that way. The way the anti-war movement functioned in Utah was through consensus. And sometimes we had 25 people and sometimes 100 people in the planning meetings. So if we would end up with 5,000 people, the way I always worked was that people would go around the room and say what they thought ought to happen. The thing that I thought worked for me was that I'd listen to everybody else first, and then I would try to synthesize the key things that individuals said that might be practical to do, always leaving out the things that I thought were crazy and
The extremes on the other side.
but having enough, saying enough about what could go on from enough sources that everybody felt included. And so I think that was my number one strength in terms of organizing with the planning groups, and then having basic control over all of the PR. Because it set the tone. There were a couple of times when we went off of, there were national movements going on, and there were themes that came out of national movements. I was also in touch with a lot of people. I went to California fairly often. I knew anti-war activists down there. There was a guy by the name of Bob Scheer, who was eventually became an LA Times writer, but was the editor of Ramparts magazine, which was very anti-war. And we brought him into town a couple of times. But he was a very solid thinker. I would say that there were lots of different people who played different roles. I very rarely spoke at the anti-war demonstrations. And if you look at my history going forward, I tend to play the back of the room, the behind-the-scenes guy, and then sometimes I ended up being a spokesman. That was not true, for instance, with Envision Utah. I definitely played the back scenes, the orchestration, but I was rarely the spokesman.
Well, and going back to Bob Scheer, for example, and others, if I understood correctly, too, and it's a pretty generally accepted fact about the anti-war movement in the United States and elsewhere, is there was no kind of formal organization. So you mentioned you had friends in California. Right. So all those types of coordination efforts were simply voluntary on your side. You weren't receiving any type of assistance or some kind of top-down.
You know, there were small political groups that were in all of the anti-war movements, the Progressive Labor Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and they're very small, and the U.S. Communist Party, but they had small numbers. And they tended to have a point of view about what it is that should be done and what the theme should be. Although they were varied quite a bit from each other because they were, in some ways, they were mortal enemies. Yeah. That's why we organized a group called United Front to End the War. But I think Jeff Fox and I had a fairly large influence in trying to include the Middle Americans, the peaceniks, and not let it become an ideological kind of presentation.
And see, to me, that's a major difference in the way Utah is approaching the protest movement than, say, Chicago or Los Angeles, for example. Everyone's, what I think would say that building consensus was important. I don't think it was everyone's priority, though. And I think Utah, and I know you kind of deflected a little bit when I say that you played a major role, so I'm just going to say you did because it's going to be printed. So,
well, I also projected that as well. I want to let you speak. You know, like what was in your view Holbrook's role?
Well, yeah, what was his contribution? Yeah. I think he just nailed it with consensus and collaboration.
Okay.
I think if there was one specific attribute about Utah that I feel is a complete differentiator, which is why I titled it the way I did, is I think Utah and Mr. Holbrook are radical in a sense, but in a different type of way. Mm-hmm. I think that they leveraged consensus and collaboration and bridge building to grow a movement inside a very conservative state. In a movement that gained a lot of attraction, not only inside the state, but outside the state, and which led to, and I think maybe even some of the best successes of the anti-war movement are what Mr. Holbrook ends up doing over the next 20 years, which is playing a role in state politics, playing a role in establishing the first community radio station in the state, and then going on to work with the homeless, to work on education projects, bettering education, and then moving into the Envision Utah role, which I think to me, and I'm not Mr. Holbrook, and I'd love to hear to see if I'm onto something here, but I feel like the anti-war movement gave him the experience, or a large part of that experience. I'm not discounting the civil rights growth, but I'm just saying you spent so much time, though, being a key player in the anti-war movement. And like I said, and let me just go back to answer your question, Jed. Not only was it consensus among the people who wanted to be involved, but it was, like I mentioned earlier, providing providing these different venues where babysitting was involved, like focusing on families in the community, which I think was a huge part of letting people know that there were other people out there who thought in similar veins, meaning they didn't follow the status quo. But there's always assumptions that go along with that. So anyways, as we move forward, though, it's the consensus about community building being one thing, a note I wrote down that Mr. Holbrook was a community organizer before that was cool, because I think ever since Barack Obama we've kind of looked at that a different way. But I really felt like Utah was set apart and different in the consensus role, and just like you mentioned, or we mentioned earlier, working with the local police, like that was. Well, I'm not saying Utah was the only state doing that. You're going to be hard-pressed to find other states where that's happening. there was not any type of congenial relationship between the two groups in most other locations. And as you mentioned too, and I found this in your papers as well, you mentioned being not only involved with the local police, but kind of being very suspicious of the federal police. Like you were more than game to work with Captain Patrick and others and with the intelligence here in Utah and coordinating your efforts with them for protection, but you mentioned several different times that you had no desire to work with the federal police. Is that fair?
Well, we didn't work with them, is all I can say. I suppose because they didn't think it was any of their business. The local police, their role was to protect us and for us to let them know what we're going to do so they could do so. Whereas the FBI were basically nosing in on an anti-war movement that was none of their business. We were Americans, we had a right to our opinion. And so that was my point of view.
And I thought it was funny too how you mentioned that federal police were pretty easily identifiable. Like they wore like a specific costume or uniform,
right,
and they could not blend in. So it was pretty easy to identify them.
Yeah, and the agent provocateurs who eventually were seen in the anti-war movement were always so extreme that if they weren't agent provocateurs, they should have been, because they'd always come. And later we learned from reading various people's FBI files who some of them were, but they were always trying to ingratiate themselves with the anti-war movement by expressing extreme points of view. But going back to the collaboration thing, collaboration really was a key element in pursuing the homeless shelter and the homeless services, and it certainly was a key to Envision Utah. And so it's sort of an experience and methodology that grew with my experience, learning from various people about how you do it and how you do it in larger situations and with new issues.
So specifically going back to what I was talking about earlier, specifically, sorry, I need to get a drink here. How did the anti-war movement impact what you end up doing over the next 20, 30 years?
Playing the media role in both NAACP and the anti-war movement taught me that mass media was very important, and that certainly was a major factor in pursuing KRCL. The nonviolent aspects of the civil rights movement taught me that was the best and only way that you could really make progress in the United States, and possibly other places. I mean, Gandhi was always a hero of mine. I read about Gandhi when I was in high school, and my heroes are Gandhi, Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and so there's a strong anti-violence, and not only as a moral question, but also as a practical, mode of operation. How do you do it, and what's the purpose of it? Your whole point of view is you're trying to influence and bring people to your point of view. You're not trying to alienate them. In terms of collaboration, I would say that developing the homeless services and the Road Home and Shelter the Homeless Committee, which is now going to be the owner of all the new shelters, was a question of getting the LDS Church, the Episcopal Church, the local business people, all the different people who might be otherwise blamed for not doing something, together to go through a methodology of research. What is the issue? What are the problems? Who are the homeless? So I learned that having a base of information on which people who collaborate can agree is an important element of collaboration, and that was the preeminent reality of Envision Utah. A base of information, what is going to happen in Utah in 20 years if we go in the same trajectory, and then letting people have that information, agree on its source and on what it means, and then figure out what the other options were to that trajectory. So base of information, collaboration, peaceful, non-alienation where possible. I mean, even Gandhi talks about sometimes you have to coerce, but that's not the same thing as to demean. To demean is to try to turn somebody into an enemy or that they're bad people. To coerce is to say, I'm going to go on strike in your factory. I mean, Gandhi actually lived in the homes of some of the people, industrialists, who he coerced. So he played it sort of, he had the personal side, and they had a very hard time diminishing him because they knew him and they liked him. And so, I mean, there's a world-class hero. Lincoln, you could say the same thing. The whole book, what's the Team of Rivals.
Team of Rivals. Yeah.
Team of Rivals. His whole conduct of the Civil War, he surrounded himself with his detractors and his opponents to pursue it. Now he was not. I mean, he used coercion. You could, if you were on the Confederate side, you would have to say that he was brutal and bloody. The sacking of Atlanta was awful. But the long-term gain of getting rid of slavery and which was no easy task, that wasn't even the original purpose of the Civil War. The original purpose was to bring the states back in. Lincoln after the carnage got to be so great, Lincoln had to find a cause that was bigger than the carnage to make it worth what had gone on, larger than that the states should be together. And that issue was slavery and the abolishing of slavery.
Mm-hmm. So,
Please.
well, just going back a little to the anti-war movement, what was, if you were to pinpoint, and I know there were probably many, but what was one of your proudest moments during that phase of your life, during the anti-war movement?
I think when 5,000 people marched down the street and from the Capitol down to Pioneer Park, and they all had different signs representing the environment and women's causes and gay rights and every kind of movement that blossomed out of the anti-war movement, and sort of seeing it sort of take on a life of its own. In many respects, the anti-war movement mimicked aspects of the civil rights movement, and many of the groups that came out of the anti-war movement also mimicked. Now, sometimes too much. Not every cause or moment is a reason for a demonstration. And so sometimes people overlearn a lesson or they misapply something. But I think simply seeing all of those different things, it was like the birth of a whole variety of new ways of going forward. And for me personally, there are lots of different ways in which that went forward. I was able to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment twice when I was in the legislature. I worked to stop the Kapirowitz power plant, coal-burning power plant in southern Utah. Played a minor role, but helping a little bit with Robert Redford in pursuing that. And I just think in terms of the women's movement, I think about my real mentors in life have not been men, they have been women. Ivy Baker Priest, Helen Brown Romney, Frances Farley, who was a state senator. Mm-hmm. Frances taught me a lot about practical politics, how you win elections and so forth. And and I don't know, I always had good relationships with men, and I got all kinds of benefits and things to happen with powerful men. but my real mentors have been women. And I don't know if that's because I was gay and it was easier for me to relate to women, or they had an easier time relating to me than the men did. I always had good relationships with the men, but I think there was a greater comfort level with women.
When did you get to know Frances Farley? Was it when you were in the legislature, or had you known her before?
No, she helped me with my campaigns.
Oh, okay.
Before she was in the state senate.
Okay.
And then she worked at for Salt Lake City Commissioner, then Glenn Greener, and I knew her through that period. She quit that job because there were too many Latinos being shot in the back by the police. And she had been active in the civil rights movement back in Minnesota before she came to Utah. So there came a time when it was, okay, it's Frances's turn. Frances needs to run for the Senate.
I remember, well, it's in the article too, a letter she wrote to you, just a short note almost from the desktop of Frances Farley, where she was talking about the respect she had for you based upon the fact that you were willing to put your literal body on the line. And then she put in kind of parentheses or a side note about, remember that time with the Volkswagen where you were laying down in protest. Can you talk a little bit about that incident? I didn't give a ton of context to it in the article, and I'd just be curious to hear a little bit more from you.
Well, one of the things that was going on as part of the Antiwar movement, some people refused to pay certain taxes towards the war, and there was some sort of telephone excise tax that was to go directly towards the war. And there was a guy who apparently was not paying it, and so the IRS came to collect it. And he called me, and I didn't even know the guy, and he told me that the IRS was at his door and that they were there to take his car. So I just rushed over and laid in front of the car.
So you'd never met this guy before?
I don't recall having met him.
That's great.
That is great. Well, maybe the other side of the coin from the question that Scott asked, your proudest moment, what's the moment that you most regret, or what do you regret from your anti-war protest days?
I can't really think of anything, because there were things that went on that shouldn't have gone on, that where there was a tone or something that in my view was not beneficial and didn't represent me. There was a very strange incident. There was a guy who we were in front of the federal office building, and there was a guy named Mike Hansen who had a big sign that, as I recall, on one side there was a picture of Stalin, and on the other side was a picture of Mao Zedong. And I went to him and I said, okay, you have a right to be here, you have a right to have that up. However, what you're putting up there is not representative of most of the people here. So he took it down. And but a few weeks later, he hijacked an aircraft to Cuba. So I was sort of wondered if my mild coercion of him not expressing himself didn't,
But if I remember correctly, you actually helped get him released.
Well, I tried. I don't know what effect I had on it, but I was asked by his parents to do what I could, and I wrote to some Cuban people in the UN, and I inquired, who to write to in Cuba, and I wrote this sort of semi-facetious letter, saying I was a local socialist leader, something I never really was, because I thought it would appeal to them.
Yeah.
And talked about the anti-war movement and what we had done and what his relationship to it was, and saying that he was young and he had, extreme views. And he didn't. It turned out he only went to Cuba because the plane couldn't go to Vietnam. He didn't actually approve of the kind of communism they had in Cuba. So
that's interesting.
Okay. Well, I think I just think just for our listeners, and it would be helpful to at least sketch out your post-anti-war days. I know you've already mentioned quite a bit of this. How, and we can be quite brief, but from the time the anti-war protests essentially end, and can we pinpoint a year for that in Utah? That you stop being involved in those?
Probably 73, 74.
Okay. And then
it wanes from 70. It just starts, when you say about 1970, 68, sure. 69, kind of at its peak.
Right.
And then by 70, it starts to go, it reduces. But like you, as Stephen mentioned, though, it does break off. People may leave the movement, but a lot of different environmentalists, LGBT, gay rights, they kind of branch off at that point, and it kind of goes on the wane over the next couple of years. By 73, 74, there's not a large anti-war movement presence in Utah.
And then a couple of years after that, you run for the Utah legislature.
I ran for the legislature in 75 and started working on trying to put what became KRCL together somewhere in the same time period, which eventually went on the air about 79.
So
December of 79.
Okay. I have my thoughts about why, but I'd like to hear you explain why KRCL was so important enough for you to leave the state legislature, which I think was a unique position for such a well-known activist to be in.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, you were able to target some very important action items, for lack of a better word, and get them done while you were in the legislature. What was it about KRCL that was so important that you were willing to leave your job to dedicate the time for it?
Well, it was... number one, it was when we were going on the air, and I had run 3 times, each time by a larger margin, had developed a lot of support, but I didn't want to give short shrift to a campaign, because I didn't want to create the impression that because my campaigns were, I was in everybody's face, I was at every door, or my family was, or somebody. And I didn't have time to do that and pursue KRCL being on the air. Plus, I didn't have time for KRCL to go on the air December 3rd, I think it was, and be in a legislative session. So it just, the reason that it was important was because it was an opportunity for a lot of different groups to have feedback on themselves, to expose the community to musics that it wasn't generally hearing, which was, music's always been important to me, always from, very early times. I've loved music of all kinds, jazz, rock and roll, classical, reggae, blues. And so having that exposure, having a feedback loop, if you will, for the women's movement, for the environmental movement, for these music groups to sponsor concerts, everything. KRCL was, I would say, it was a little more vigorous in its pursuit of all those groups and those issues in its earlier days than it is now. In part because a lot of the things that were done then are now mainstream, and you see in the Tribune. So you don't need to deal with it as if it's a rare and unique. And also the minority aspect. My brother married a Samoan woman, so I saw that we had Polynesian programming on the air. I became pretty involved with Mexico. I've supported some students in Mexico, still am, and go to Mexico a lot. So having Spanish spoken on the station and recognizing the growth of that community in Utah, which is even much bigger than it was. And that time you didn't have the big variety of Spanish speaking stations.
Did you have constituents who were pretty frustrated, though, that you were leaving the state legislature?
I don't remember anybody saying
no. They were excited.
I probably never saw them again because I wasn't out there going door to door anymore, and I just, I'm kind of in something or I'm not. However, as the legislature, I was back up there numerous times as a nonprofit lobbyist, both in regard to the homeless, getting the state homeless coordinating committee set up, and with Coalition for Utah's Future, which became Envision Utah, getting the first insurance, requiring insurers to give insurance through parents to age 25, which didn't happen nationally till Obamacare, but it happened 20 years ago because of the support of the coalition and my lobbying up there. And there were other things along the way, the State Office of Child Care, just the whole Envision Utah, the thinking about the future. I would say that everything is sort of folds in and mixes and becomes sort of like a big stew for me. But I do tend to be, I'm in something and then I'm not, and I'm in something and then I'm not.
And we were talking before recording that you were executive director of Envision Utah,
right?
And its predecessor, Coalition for
Utah's Future and Project 2000,
for 15 years.
For 15 years.
Okay, and
I did get paid for that.
Sure.
Not very much
until
late.
Yeah.
When I finally got a decent salary, the Hewlett Foundation, it wasn't because my board said, oh, you should get more money. The Hewlett Foundation looked at what we were doing and said, you're not paying this guy enough money, and we're giving you all this money. So, great.
That's helpful. Well, we don't need to talk about it. There's lots to say about, I'm sure, Envision Utah, but what have you been up to since Envision?
I retired from Envision Utah because of some neck problems. It's just too hard to sit in meetings and, in a fixed position. So the main thing I've really been involved with is working with and supporting students in Mexico and for various lengths of time. And there are three stories that I think are interesting that come out of that. Three very distinct immigration stories. One is the kid I call my adoptive son, Ernesto, who's from El Salvador but came to Mexico illegally. And they're no better about people coming from El Salvador than we are about people coming from Mexico. So he was there illegally. I didn't know that until quite far along. I was supporting him in elementary, junior, and high school. And when he went to get his degree, I had to come up with a lawyer and money to get him legalized, or they wouldn't give him his degree. So
was he studying here in the U.S.?
No, he was studying in Mexico.
But because he was an illegal immigrant in Mexico.
Right.
Okay.
So that's one immigration story. Another one is a kid I was supporting in high school, and his mother and two sibs came to the U.S., called me, I didn't know they were coming, called me and said, Tony is in an ICE detention camp in New York, and the mother is in Fresno, California with, what do you call those bracelets that the police put on your ankles? Ankle bracelets. And they came to the U.S. seeking asylum. They had permission to enter. When they came to the border, Tony, because he was over 18, they sent him to an ICE camp instead of to stay with his mother. So I had to work with Hatch's office to get him out and sent back to his mother. And they're still fighting to stay. And the reason was because they from Acapulco, and they had an older brother who was kidnapped and murdered, and the family was threatened. And, the state of Guerrero is an awful, awful mess. And the third one, who just finished first automotive school and then got a scholarship from the Nissan company. He was from Mexico. He came to the U.S. when he was 18, got kicked out when he was 36. As it turned out, I later learned for good reasons. He had become, and I didn't know this all the time I was helping him through school, I only learned it after. He had been arrested with $300,000 and some odd worth of cocaine, and he was served 7 years in prison. And then they said, sign this that says you'll never come back to the United States, and they kicked him out. So when I met him, he was sort of surviving, had all of his, his 2 kids and his wife were back in the U.S., he couldn't re-enter. So again, I didn't know the larger story. Well, now he's great. He doesn't use any drugs. He doesn't drink. He has a taxi and he has a skill with the Nissan company, and he's going to start his own garage.
So how did you coordinate these interactions of helping these? Did you go through a foundation, or is this something you're just doing independently? And if so, how do you contact or get to know who they are?
Well, I go there a lot, so I'd see them.
Oh, you go to Mexico?
Yeah.
Oh.
But, email and texting and phoning.
Okay, so informal. This isn't through. Okay.
No.
Interesting.
Wow, that sounds like great work. Yeah. I mean, let's see. I guess we could ask, well, what are the pressing, we could come up with a long list, pressing moral issues of our day and pressing issues for Utah residents. I'm sure you've got opinions about that.
Well, I think growth is still the biggest issue, but you probably say education is a big issue because there's so many kids in school.
Yeah.
But I'm not having any kids in school. I don't, know about that. Really, I don't know what problems they face. In terms of the U.S., there are so many issues that it's, the one thing about having 3 networks, as we had in the earlier days, and there was sort of one. Everybody had the same experience. Everybody was kind of going from the same playbook. Everybody saw the same thing, reacted the same thing. Now, I think the internet and the dispersion of interest into smaller and smaller groups where people think they're in touch, and they are. They might be in touch with 200,000 people around the world, but they don't know their neighbor, and they don't know their neighbor's issues. And whatever it is they're dealing with this 200,000 people on their issue isn't connecting in the community. And I think that you see this with all sorts of political movements where people are not talking to each other, they're talking to themselves. They're talking to people they already agree with.
Do you have what about, you've spent your life fighting for marginalized groups? What are the marginalized groups we should be thinking about today? And what needs to be done in those areas?
Well, I had not thought that immigrants were necessarily marginalized until Donald Trump, and I think that he has worked very hard to marginalize them, and it's a moral tragedy, the kind of nonsense he puts out about immigrants. If you look at the high-tech companies, a number of the CEOs and developers of these companies were immigrants or were first-generation immigrants. The people who paint your house and who do your housework and garden for you tend to be immigrants. They're in entry-level positions, and they pick your fruit. And I really am horrified that the United States is coming across as Donald Trump sees it, because it's not how I see the United States.
Yeah. Well, Scott, anything else that you'd like to throw out there?
Yeah, just one last question, if it's all right with you, Stephen. I'd like to know, you civil rights, anti-war, some time in the legislature, starting the community radio station, and then working on several different issues, and then moving into the coalition, which later becomes Envision Utah, and then continuing with, like you were just talking about, some independent assistance to different individuals. This entire time, as Jed pointed out, you're working with marginalized groups, with marginalized people. What would your advice be for people listening who want to make a difference? From what I can tell, that's what your life focused on, making a difference. What would your advice to those people be?
First, understand what it is that you're representing and feeling. Who really are the people that you're concerned about? What do they think? What do they want? and two, who is it that can do something for them. You need to target decision makers who actually have the responsibility to make a decision. And my experience is that it's a long process of education. And I'll give you what I think is a good example of how that can be done. It's one that I played a very minor role in. Francis Farley played a big one, and that was when the MX missile was going to be located in virtually every valley between Utah and Reno, in what was kind of a doomsday scenario of little missiles running from cave to cave. Francis had just learned about it, coming from a state committee in which they interact with the federal government about things they're going to do. And we were on our way up to Sundance, and she told us about it. And I said, there's only one institution in the state that can have any impact, and that's the LDS Church. That's almost the only thing I ever did on the subject. Francis then went about bringing in deputy CIA directors, generals, admirals, to meet with people in the LDS Church. So there was a long education process. Later, Ed Firmage knew how to work a decision-making process within the LDS Church, but Francis had done much of the education, which had been in the, I think it might have been called the Public Affairs Committee at that time. I'm not sure what it's called today. So I think that, again, information, it doesn't happen overnight. And any time that you can connect people with the issue. When we were doing the homeless shelter, I remember taking a busload of legislators down to one of the soup kitchens. And I called Bob Garf, who was the Speaker of the House at that time, a Republican, and I was clearly a liberal Democrat by that time, but I knew Bob. And I said, who can we get from the legislature on Shelter the Homeless Committee? And he said, well, why don't you get one of my conservatives, Irv Skousen? And Irv was a brother to Cleon Skousen. And Irv came down, and he became part of the committee. We had the LDS Church. We had a variety of business people and institutions. And then we did a big research piece. We did a big Who Are the Homeless statewide, had master students from the various schools. And so this was done on behalf of them. They then had the information so that everyone was working from the same playbook, not unlike what happened with Envision Utah. People were able to see this is the problem, this is who the homeless are, so therefore this is what we should do. And I think that, so my following up, my advice is know the people you're concerned about, know who the decision makers are, and how can you involve them in the research in the first place so that they're part of it. You're not just walking up there saying, well, this is who they are, and so forth. Mm-hmm. They're part of it from the beginning. And when we had the LDS Church, it was no accident that they were the first large donor to Shelter the Homeless and the Road Home, because they were intimately involved in the discussions about who the homeless are, what the numbers were, what the potential solutions were. So I just think that those three things are, the key things.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can end with talking about briefly the Road Home. We're here in the Rio Grande building, so the Rio Grande neighborhood clearly is. The Road Home is right next door. How much, what advice would you give to those who are struggling with this issue of homelessness in our city and in the state? What steps could we take, given your experience and your understanding of the issue, could we take to solve and to help remediate that problem?
I stayed on Shelter the Homeless Committee until about 2.5 years ago. And I believe I was the first to inform them that the streets were out of control in the area around the shelter, that the drug dealers from Honduras were and working for the narcotraficantes from Mexico were dominating the scene, and that it was not the homeless per se, not to say that people on drugs can't be homeless. A lot of people are homeless who have drug problems, but it wasn't the predominant problem. And that the road home was being blamed for something which was really the problem of the mental health authorities in the state and the county and the drug rehabilitation authorities and the police, and that to put the blame on the road home had made no sense. They were simply operating a program surrounded by a problem much larger than themselves. So what has happened since is that, perhaps sometimes ham-handedly, but I think generally to the good, a lot has happened in taking people who were, taking the serious drug dealers. I'm not talking about the guy who's a user who gets hold of one hit to sell to somebody else so he can afford his habit. I'm talking about the real professionals from the Paisa gang from Honduras and the people they work for, really, the narcotraficantes of Mexico. And I think some has been done. This thing that's a mystery to me is why that wasn't done before, why the police sat on it so long, why there was some picking up of the street dealer, but there was very little where does the drug dealer get his stuff, the tracking it back. So I think what you have now is a much safer, cleaner environment for the homeless. And one of the problems that I see is that a lot of the businesses in the area blame the shelter, and much of the impetus to move the shelter came about from blaming the shelter for what was going on around it. So now that that's all cleaned up and you don't have that same problem in anything like the same degree, you have this smaller shelter system being built, which is not even remotely adequate for either the future need or the current need, because homeless people need a home. And the current economic environment simply does not allow for development from the normal business community, a unit that a person who is homeless can afford to get into. So what's going to happen if they close this is that you're going to have 3 shelters that are inadequate to the size of the population. They're going to be pushing them into drug programs that are inadequate to the size, and supposedly into homes that don't exist. So quite clearly, and then I would add to that, the legislature's involvement in this is yet to be seen to be long-term and permanent. With Greg Hughes leaving the legislature, it's not at all clear to me that you're going to have anybody in the legislature who's going to keep the state involved. And I don't think it's an accident that you have state police down here, not just city police, but state police. That's because of Greg Hughes, which is a good thing. And the question still needs to be asked, what happened with the Salt Lake Police Department? Was it lack of leadership? Was there something going on in the department that they were unwilling to deal with the underlying issues of the real drug involvement? Where was the DEA in all of this until this larger focus took place? And I think a lot of that has never been really discussed and understood in the community. I have my own views about it, but I don't want to just speculate.
Sure. Well, all very fascinating. Lots more clearly to iron out on that issue, but I appreciate your thoughts, and appreciate both of you for taking the time to do this. Scott, for your article, which is nearly out in people's mailboxes, and we're all very excited. So thank you for doing that. And,
my pleasure.
And Steve for both taking the time and just for your long body of impressive work. Really is very impressive, and pleasure to speak with you.
My long body used to be 6'2", now it's 6 foot.
About 6 foot. Well, that's not what I meant, but yeah, that as well. But yeah, thank you.